Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I worked night security at Arlington National Cemetery in 2021. My shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. It was usually a quiet job, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears until you started hearing your own pulse. I'd sit in my truck for the first hour, check my patrol schedule, sip coffee that went cold too fast, then make rounds through the sections. The place had its own atmosphere at night, different from any other spot I've ever worked. The silence wasn't just from the lack of people. It was a heavy, still kind of silence that seemed to settle on your shoulders and stay there. The roads inside the cemetery were narrow and lined with white headstones that reflected even the faintest bit of moonlight. When the fog rolled in off the Potomac, it got thicker than smoke. Some nights it was so dense that the beam from my flashlight would stop dead a few feet in front of me. You couldn't see the trees or the gates or even the rows of stones until you were almost on top of them. That November night, the air was cold enough that my breath came out white. I remember because I'd parked my truck near Section 60 to stretch my legs. Section 60 is where most of the newer graves are. Men and women who served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other recent wars. It always felt heavier there. Maybe because the stones were still clean, not yet weathered or covered in moss. Families visited often, even at odd hours, leaving photos, medals, coins, or sometimes just handwritten letters weighed down by small stones. I stepped out of the truck with my flashlight and did what I always did. Walked a slow loop along the path, checked the perimeter fence, then cut between the rows to make sure no one was inside after hours. It wasn't unusual to find someone sitting near a grave late at night, usually a parent or a spouse who didn't want to leave. The rule was to give them a moment, then quietly let them know the gates were closed. But that night, there was no one. Just the cold air, the faint hum of distant traffic, and the quiet crunch of frost under my boots. I was halfway down the second row when I noticed something that didn't fit. The dew on the grass had frozen into a thin layer of frost that shimmered under the beam of my light. Right there, cutting across the rows, were footprints. Small ones, bare feet. The toes and heels were clearly visible. The frost melted slightly where the person had stepped. I stopped and just stared at them for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. They were too small for an adult man, maybe a woman or a child, but the pattern was odd. Light steps spaced close together, leading deeper into the section. I followed them, shining the light ahead carefully. They went around a headstone, then curved off toward another row before suddenly stopping. Not fading, not leading off somewhere else, just stopping mid-step like the person had taken half a stride and vanished. I crouched down to look closer. The last print was sharp, clear, heel down, toes lifted, as if whoever it was had just been walking and then wasn't. The grass beyond was untouched. I stood there for a while, listening. The silence felt different now, colder. I could hear the faint ticking of my watch and my own breathing in the mask I wore. Nothing moved. I scanned around with the flashlight, half expecting to see someone crouched behind a stone, but there was no one. I checked the nearby trees, bare branches shifting slightly in the breeze, nothing else. My radio hissed suddenly, just a burst of static that made me jump. Then a voice from control. "Unit 4, your GPS just dropped off. You still on patrol?" I looked down at the small unit clipped to my chest rig. The light that usually blinked green was flashing red. The little screen said "Signal lost." That had never happened before. Not once. The system used high-band military-grade tracking for safety. It wasn't supposed to go out unless the battery was dead, but mine had been fully charged. I told them I was fine, just a possible dead zone, and that I'd check it back at the truck. My voice felt strange when I said it, louder than I meant it to be, cutting through that deep stillness. When the radio clicked off again, the silence seemed even worse. I turned back toward the truck, scanning the ground as I walked. My own boot prints showed clearly in the frost. two parallel lines leading from the gravel path to the graves. When I reached the point where I'd first seen the barefoot ones, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There were new prints now, wet ones, small, barefoot but fresh, pressed right next to mine, heading in the opposite direction, back toward the way I'd come from. For a second, I thought I was imagining it, but they glistened under the flashlight beam, moisture still beading at the edges, meaning they'd been made seconds earlier. I could even see the tiny ridges of skin, like fingerprints but on the soles. The realization hit me that someone had walked there while I was only a few yards away. Someone barefoot, silent, unseen. I swept the light across the graves, slow and steady, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Nothing. Just those endless rows of white stones and the breath of wind shifting the leaves. I didn't run, but I walked fast. I could hear my gear rattling softly. Radio, keys, flashlight, battery pack, all louder than I remembered them being. I climbed back into the truck, locked the doors out of pure instinct, and sat for a moment trying to get my breathing under control. My GPS was still blinking red. I tapped it, reset it, unplugged the battery and plugged it back in. Nothing. Signal lost. The rest of the night passed in slow motion. I stayed mostly near the main road after that, checking gates and fences, keeping the truck headlights sweeping across the fields. Every time I caught a glimpse of Section 60 in the beam, I felt my stomach tighten. Around 4 in the morning, I went back one last time to make sure the area was secure before the next shift came in. The frost was gone by then, melted into dew. The footprints, mine and the small ones, were gone. Just damp grass and the faint smell of cold earth. When I handed off my report at 6, I didn't mention what I'd seen. I wrote routine patrol, no incidents. It sounded better than trying to explain barefoot prints that started and stopped in frozen grass. The tech guy checked my GPS unit later that morning and said the antenna had failed. He swapped it out, said it was just a glitch, but I'd used that same model for months without a single issue. The timing of it still bothers me. The way the signal dropped exactly when I found those prints. I kept working there another week. But after that night, I couldn't focus. Every sound made me turn my head. Every dark corner between the stones felt like someone standing just out of sight. I told myself it was the cold, the late hours, fatigue messing with my senses. But the feeling didn't fade. On my last shift, I parked at the same spot and sat in the truck with the engine off. The cemetery stretched out ahead, quiet and endless. The headlights caught the tips of the headstones, and for a moment it looked like they were lined up in motion, marching away into the dark. I thought about those small prints, how they had appeared, how they had stopped. There was no logical reason for it. No trick of light, no condensation pattern that could form like that. They were real, solid, and then gone. When 6 a.m. came, I turned in my badge and radio. I told the supervisor I had other work lined up. He asked if something had happened. I said no, just needed a change. That was the truth in the simplest way I could put it. I did need a change. I needed to sleep again, without replaying the sound of my boots crunching next to small bare footprints that shouldn't have been there. I still drive past the cemetery sometimes on my way into the city. During the day, it looks peaceful. Sunlight on the marble stones, tourists walking quietly along the paths. But every time I glance toward Section 60, I remember that night. The way the air felt thick and electric. The way the footprints stopped mid-step. I never saw anything like that again. But the memory sits there, sharp and cold, like the frost under my boots that night. I never reported it. Never told anyone from work. Some things you don't explain. You just leave them where they happened and walk away. I was 22 when I started working nights at the Circle K off I-40. It was one of those highway gas stations that looks the same no matter what state you're in. Bright lights, humming coolers, a coffee station that always smelled faintly burnt, and that constant buzz from the old fluorescent bulbs that never stopped flickering near the back wall. My shift ran from midnight to 8 in the morning, 5 nights a week. It wasn't the kind of job anyone dreamed of, but it paid just enough for rent and food, and I didn't have many other options at the time. The Circle K sat on its own stretch of highway about 20 miles from town. There was a small forested patch behind the lot, and nothing but open fields on the other side. At night, it was quiet in a way that almost felt wrong. I'd stand behind the counter with the hum of the soda machines and the buzzing lights and the occasional rumble of an 18-wheeler passing outside. Sometimes I'd go an hour without seeing a single car. That night, it was early spring, cold but not freezing. I remember the air feeling heavy, like it gets right before a storm, even though the sky was clear. Business had been dead all night. A few truckers came through around midnight, grabbed coffee, maybe a sandwich, and went on their way. After that, nothing. I'd restocked the candy shelves twice just to stay awake. It was 3:30 a.m. when the bell over the door jingled. I looked up and saw a man walk in. Jeans, plain gray t-shirt, no jacket, and no shoes. At first I thought maybe he'd been in a wreck or something, because his feet were dark with dirt and blood, especially around the heels. He walked slow, almost like every step hurt. He didn't say anything, just went straight to the cooler, grabbed a bottle of water, and came up to the counter. He looked young, maybe late 20s, though it was hard to tell. His face was pale and his hair was wet, like he'd been sweating or walking in dew. I remember the way his eyes wouldn't stay still. They kept darting toward the door like he was afraid someone was following him. When I asked if he was all right, he looked up for the first time and said, "Yeah, just got dropped off." His voice was calm, but something about it felt off. The way he said it didn't fit the situation. His feet were bleeding, no shoes. Dropped off didn't make sense. He paid in cash, exact change, then walked out without another word. I watched him through the window as he crossed the parking lot. He didn't head toward the highway. Instead, he walked straight toward the patch of forest behind the store. The way he moved made me uneasy. Not stumbling, not running, just walking steady and slow into the dark until he disappeared between the trees. For a while, I tried not to think about it. I told myself maybe his car broke down. Maybe someone really did drop him off and he was cutting through to a house nearby. But that part of the road didn't lead anywhere. Behind the woods, there were miles of brush and then a drainage creek. Nothing else. 10 minutes later, the bell rang again. I looked up and for a second I thought it was the same man. Same build, same height, even the same gray t-shirt. But this one was clean. Shoes, jeans with no dirt, his hair neat. He didn't have any injuries. He walked up to the counter and stood there, quiet, scanning the store like he was looking for someone. He finally asked if I'd seen anyone come through barefoot. I told him yeah. A few minutes ago, guy bought water and went out back. I thought maybe they were traveling together or something. The man stared at me for a long moment. His eyes looked exhausted but not confused, like he already knew what I was going to say. After a pause, he just said, "He's not supposed to be out." Then he turned and left. I stood there for a while after the door shut, trying to process what I'd just heard. He's not supposed to be out. It didn't make sense. I thought maybe it was some mental health situation, or maybe someone had escaped from a hospital or a group home nearby. I looked around for my phone, thinking about calling the county sheriff's number I had taped to the register. But part of me didn't want to get involved. I'd seen my fair share of weird stuff working nights. Drunk drivers, people sleeping in their cars, couples screaming in the parking lot. You learn to just stay behind the counter and keep quiet. But something about those two stuck with me. They looked almost identical, except for the shoes and the state they were in. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I stepped outside around 4:30 to smoke and looked toward the forest. The edge of it was pitch black, the kind of dark that swallows everything after a few feet. I didn't hear anything. No crickets, no wind, nothing. I finished my cigarette fast and went back inside. Around 5 COD, I started my usual cleaning routine, sweeping the floor, wiping down the counter, emptying the trash bins outside. The eastern sky was just starting to lighten when I saw a flicker of red and blue reflecting off the store windows. At first, I thought maybe someone had been pulled over on the highway, but then I realized the lights were coming from the service road that ran behind the station. Near the forest, 2 sheriff's vehicles were parked down there, their lights spinning in the dawn haze. I couldn't see much from where I was, but it looked like they'd blocked the access road with yellow tape. Another vehicle showed up a few minutes later, an unmarked SUV. The cops were moving around in the brush with flashlights. I kept working, trying not to stare, but my stomach felt tight. When my relief finally came in at 8, I clocked out fast. The sun was fully up by then, and I figured I'd take the long way home to see what had happened. As I pulled onto the highway, I slowed when I reached the access road. It was still blocked. The tape stretched from one post to the other, fluttering in the morning wind. I saw 2 deputies standing near the ditch, talking to a man in plain clothes. They had those serious faces you only see when something bad's been found. I couldn't see exactly where they were looking, but one of them was pointing toward the tree line. There were tire marks in the dirt and the grass looked trampled. I didn't stop. I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the image of that barefoot man walking into the woods. For days after, I kept checking the local news, but there was nothing about it. No mention of police activity, no missing person report, nothing. It was like it never happened. I stayed at that job for another few months, and every night after that, I'd catch myself glancing toward the trees out back, half expecting to see someone standing there. I never did, but sometimes right before dawn I'd think I saw movement at the edge of the dark, just a shape, gone as soon as I looked twice. Eventually I quit, moved to a different town, started working daytime shifts. But every time I drive past that stretch of I-40, I slow down and look at that Circle K. It's still there, still lit up against the dark fields, humming with the same machines, surrounded by that same patch of woods. And even though I never found out what happened, I can't forget how that second man looked at me before he left. Not angry, not scared, just tired, like he'd been chasing something for a long time, like he already knew what I'd seen, and that it wasn't the first time it had happened. I don't know who that barefoot man was, or where he went after he walked into those trees. But I do know one thing. The police tape wasn't there for nothing. And every time I think about that night, I still hear the doorbell chime, the sound of his feet sticking faintly to the tile, and the way his voice sounded when he said, "I just got dropped off," like he really believed it. I worked facilities overnight at O'Hare International Airport. My job was simple but isolating. Inspect maintenance areas, fix lights, reset alarms, check tunnels, make sure nothing was leaking or sparking. Most people never think about the network of service tunnels that runs beneath the terminals and runways, but they stretch for miles, low concrete passages lined with pipes and cable conduits. The air down there always felt a little damp, like the concrete never completely dried out. The hum of air vents and dripping condensation made it feel alive in a slow, mechanical way. In July 2022, it was especially hot and muggy. Even underground you could feel the humidity pressing in. That night my shift started at 10 p.m. Everything was quiet through midnight. Around 2 a.m., dispatch radioed me about a persistent alarm tone near Tunnel B3. Something high-pitched that had been going off for a while. They wanted me to check it out before it triggered any higher-level notifications. Tunnel B3 was one of the older sections, narrower, rougher concrete, barely tall enough to stand straight. It ran under a service road between 2 hangars, and wasn't used much except for electrical access. The entrance door was tucked behind a supply cage. When I unlocked it, the metal handle felt wet from condensation. I put on my hard hat, switched on my headlamp, and stepped inside. The sound was faint at first, a sharp electronic beep echoing down the corridor every few seconds. The kind of tone that gets under your skin because it never stops, always bouncing off the walls. I started walking toward it, my light sweeping across old conduit lines and water stains. My boots left soft imprints on the dusty floor. The further I went, the louder the beep got, though it was hard to tell direction because everything echoed endlessly. After about 200 feet, something strange happened. The tone changed pitch, subtly, like it glitched for a second or reacted to something. I froze and listened. Another beep. It was slightly higher now. I took another step. The sound shifted again, almost like it was tied to my movement. I stood still, waited. The tone steadied, the same as before. I took 2 steps forward. It changed again. I tried the radio. "Control, this is facilities. I'm in B3 checking the alarm." Just static. I moved the antenna, tried again. Nothing but static hiss. It wasn't totally unusual for reception to cut out underground, but I'd had signal in this section before. Then I noticed something on the ground ahead, darker patches against the gray concrete. I crouched and aimed my light closer. Footprints. Barely visible at first, but definitely there. Wet footprints, size 10 or 11 maybe, spaced evenly. Heading deeper down the tunnel. You could see where droplets had splashed off the toes. They were fresh enough that they still glistened in the light. I looked behind me. Nothing. Just my own dusty boot tracks. No sign of anyone else. The tunnel ahead curved slightly, disappearing into shadow. The beeping kept going, steady and mechanical. I followed the prints. Each one was a little lighter than the last, like whoever made them was drying off as they walked. The tunnel walls grew closer together, and the air felt heavier, thicker. There was a faint metallic smell like rust mixed with old wiring. A few light fixtures were mounted along the ceiling, but most were dead, so my headlamp cut through complete blackness. Pipes ran along the sides, dripping water in slow intervals. The sound of those drops mixed with the beeping, making it hard to tell how far away the source was. I reached a point where the footprints ended near a metal junction box set into the wall. The beeping was loudest there. The panel's cover hung open, one hinge broken. Inside were bundles of colored wires, half of them snipped clean. Someone had stripped the insulation back on a few, rewired a small speaker, and attached a motion sensor to it with electrical tape. Every time I moved, the sensor picked it up and shifted the tone. I just stared at it for a moment, confused. This wasn't any standard setup. It looked deliberate, like someone had been experimenting, testing how far the sound could travel maybe. But why here in an unused tunnel? The cuts were clean, made with a proper tool, not torn or damaged by age. I looked around again. The space behind me was empty, just the long stretch of tunnel disappearing into black. I could hear faint water trickling from somewhere up ahead, but nothing else. I checked the ground again. The footprints stopped exactly at that panel. No prints leading back the other way. For a second, I felt a cold prickle up my neck. Whoever had been down here hadn't come back out this way, or at least not while leaving visible prints. I told myself maybe they had another exit. There were crossover sections and ladder shafts that led up to maintenance closets in the terminals. But all of those were supposed to be locked. I used my flashlight to inspect the surrounding walls. No fresh tool marks, no displaced dust, nothing that looked like a new opening. Just old concrete patched decades ago. The silence pressed in except for the beep and the faint static from my radio. I could hear my own breathing echo back at me. I pulled my phone out to take a picture, but even that felt wrong somehow. Like documenting it would make it more unsettling. Still, I took a couple shots and then cut the power to the circuit, killing the tone. The sudden quiet was immediate and almost painful. Without that sound, the space felt heavier. I started heading back, keeping my light sweeping from side to side. Every step echoed louder than before. When I reached the halfway point, I thought I heard something faint. Another set of footsteps, soft and wet, just out of sync with mine. I stopped and listened. Nothing. The sound had vanished. I stood there for a long time, barely breathing, waiting to hear it again. Just dripping water. I kept going. Faster this time. When I got back to the entrance, I locked the gate behind me and called control from my phone once I had signal. I reported the vandalism and asked if anyone else had been logged near B3 that night. They checked and told me no one had clearance in that section. Security came down later to inspect it. They photographed the wiring, made notes, said they'd check badge logs and maintenance schedules. I never heard what came of that. The next day, one of the supervisors told me security thought it was probably an act of vandalism, maybe a contractor or a board worker from another shift. But the access records never showed anyone entering through the tunnel doors during that time window. They even checked the floor cameras near the maintenance entrances. No one had passed through between midnight and 3 a.m. I didn't tell them about the footprints. I wasn't sure how to explain them without sounding paranoid. But they stuck with me. The shape, the wet shine under my light, the way they ended right at that open panel. After that, I stopped going alone into the tunnels. I always brought another tech, or at least waited until someone was on nearby duty. We started working in pairs for all below-ground checks. Nobody officially said it was because of what happened in B3, but everyone knew that story. A few weeks later, I went back with another guy to replace the cut wiring and close the panel properly. The place still smelled faintly of metal and mildew. The concrete floor had dried completely, no footprints, no marks. But when we unscrewed the panel door, we found something small wedged inside behind the wiring. A piece of rubber sole, torn from a work boot. It wasn't ours, and it didn't match any of the issued boots on record. That was the last time I went into that section. I still worked nights at O'Hare for another year, but I made sure my rounds stayed above ground, where the noise of the airport drowned out the silence. There's something about those tunnels, their long, empty stretches, the constant hum of machinery, the way sound bends and repeats, that makes you realize how easy it would be for someone to disappear down there, unnoticed. Every time I drive past the airport now, I think about that motion sensor, the footprints, and how the alarm tone changed when I moved. Someone had been testing sound in those tunnels that night, figuring out how far it would reach, maybe how long it would take for someone to respond. Whatever their reason, I was the one who walked into it. And the truth is, even now, I still don't know if they ever left. During the lockdown, I worked nights alone in a small office at a towing yard just off Route 11, about 20 miles outside of town. The company had 3 trucks and 5 drivers total, all on rotation. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The building itself was nothing fancy. A single room with old linoleum floors, a coffee pot that never really got cleaned, and a bank of radios along one wall that constantly hissed and popped with static. Outside, the lot was fenced in, filled with wrecked cars covered in snow, their bumpers hanging loose and headlights fogged over. Most nights were quiet, especially after midnight. You fill out dispatch logs, check weather reports, note fuel levels, and wait for something to happen. The radio static becomes this weird background noise that you stop hearing after a while. Sometimes I'd go hours without a single call, just sitting there with the fluorescent lights buzzing above me, and the hum of the small space heater at my feet. The whole world felt empty during lockdown. No traffic, no people, no movement except for snow drifting under the security lights. That night, December 14th, it had been snowing since late afternoon. The forecast said 8 inches before morning, but by 2 a.m., there was already close to a foot on the ground. Roads were slick, visibility low. Perfect night for wrecks, if you can call it that. I remember stirring instant coffee into a styrofoam cup when the radio finally crackled alive. It was Frank, one of our drivers. Mid-40s, quiet guy, former mechanic. Reliable. He said he was about 3 miles down Route 212, heading back from a tow when he saw a car off the shoulder, nose buried in a snowbank. That stretch of 212 is flat farmland, no houses for miles, just dark fields and the occasional fence line. He said the car's headlights were still on, engine running, but no one inside. I told him to hang back and radio if he found any sign of the driver. He acknowledged. Then there was silence except for static. Maybe a minute later he came back, but his tone was different. Shaky. He said the driver's door had just closed by itself. He sounded spooked, said he hadn't touched it. Before I could reply, there was a brief burst of static. Then his line went dead. I tried calling back, nothing. The radio was just dead air. I waited a few seconds, thinking maybe he'd lost signal in the snow. Then I called the sheriff's office. They said they'd send a deputy to check it out. While waiting, I kept trying the radio. No response. The snow outside was coming down heavier, wind starting to push it sideways. The whole yard was buried by then, white on white under the yellow lights. I remember staring at those lights, listening to that static, and feeling something in my stomach twist, a kind of wrongness I couldn't explain. When the deputy finally radioed in, about 40 minutes later, his voice was calm but tight. He said both vehicles were there. The car was still idling, headlights aimed into the snowbank. The tow truck was parked a few feet behind it. Engine running, driver's door wide open. No one inside. They found Frank's footprints leading from the truck to the car, circling around once, then stopping abruptly about 5 feet behind the rear bumper. Just stopped. No scuffle marks, no drag lines. Just stopped. The snow around was untouched, smooth except for wind ripples. They searched the nearby ditch, the fields, the small patch of woods a few hundred yards out. Nothing. I stayed at the office until after sunrise, waiting for updates. The deputy came by around 8. He looked exhausted. He said they were calling in a search team with dogs, but the snow and wind were making it almost impossible. He wanted to listen to Frank's radio log from the night. I pulled up the recording system. It's an old setup that saves everything automatically. Time-stamped files, one for each transmission. We found his last call and played it. His voice came through clear at first. He says, "Yeah, there's a car off the shoulder here, looks like a black sedan. Engine's running." Then he breathes heavy into the mic, walks closer. You can hear the crunch of snow under his boots, the soft hum of the idling engine. He pauses, says something muffled like "no one inside." Then a few seconds of silence. The next thing is the sound of the car door creaking open, then a dull thump as it shuts. Frank's voice comes back. Shaky. Door just closed. Then the line cuts for half a second. What followed is what stuck with me. Just before the recording ends, right under the static, you can hear a faint metallic sound. Slow, uneven. It almost sounds like someone dragging tire chains across pavement. Metal links scraping, catching, then dragging again. That's it. Then silence. They played it over and over. Nobody could figure out where that sound came from. The sheriff thought maybe it was just the wind hitting something loose on the truck. Maybe chains hanging off the tow bed. But the pitch of it didn't sound right. It sounded closer. Too close, like it was next to the microphone. They searched the area for 3 days. Brought in dogs, drones, even checked the river 2 miles south. Nothing. No footprints beyond that stopping point. No body, no signs of struggle. Just a pair of idling vehicles and a pattern of prints that led nowhere. I kept working nights after that. Someone had to. The snow finally melted a few weeks later, but every time the radio crackled, I'd get this weird pulse of anxiety. It wasn't just because Frank was gone. It was because of the recording. I had to replay it for the insurance report, for state investigators, for our own management. Each time I heard that faint dragging sound, I noticed something new. An echo maybe, like it was bouncing off something nearby. When they took the truck back to the yard, I had to inventory it. The inside was clean, keys still in the ignition. Coffee thermos half full in the cup holder. His phone was on the passenger seat, dead battery. Chains were still coiled neatly on the tow bed, none missing, none unwound. The sedan he'd stopped for turned out to be registered to a man from 2 towns over. They found him 3 days later at home. Alive. Said he'd skidded into the bank earlier that evening. Got a ride back with a friend to get a shovel in the morning. He'd left the car running because he didn't want the battery to die. That part made sense. But nothing else did. No one ever found a trace of Frank. No footprints beyond that one circle. No torn fabric, no blood, nothing. The snow showed everything and nothing at the same time. You could see the story written in it up to the point it stopped, and then it just ended. Clean. The case went cold by February. His wife came by the office once to collect his things. She asked if we'd found the recording. I told her we had. She asked what he'd said before it cut off. I didn't tell her about the sound at the end. She didn't need that image stuck in her head. Sometimes late at night, when the snow starts again and the roads go quiet, I think about that sound. I know it probably was just something mechanical, a loose chain or a bracket shifting in the cold, but the way it came through the radio still bothers me. It wasn't rhythmic, not like a machine. It was uneven, like something being dragged slowly, stopping and starting, scraping close to the mic. The office is still the same. The static's still there, soft and constant. The heater still rattles. The tow yard fills with snow every winter, burying the old wrecks until they look like white lumps under the lights. I still make coffee in that same cracked pot. Still log calls into the same system. Once in a while, a driver calls in from Route 212, saying the snow's piling up near the old mile markers, or that visibility's dropping. And every time I picture that night, the open truck door, the footprints ending 5 feet away, the sound of chains moving where nothing else moved. I guess that's what sticks with me the most, not knowing where he went, just knowing exactly where he stopped. I worked nights as a janitor at St. Luke's Hospital for about 3 years. It was a decent job, quiet most nights, and I liked being alone. My shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 in the morning. The halls were usually empty by midnight, except for the occasional nurse doing rounds or a patient wandering out of their room. Most of my work was cleaning floors, emptying bins, wiping down glass, and restocking supplies. The basement level was always last on my route. Storage rooms, laundry area, boiler room, and a row of old service elevators no one used anymore. I liked saving it for last because it meant I wouldn't have to see anyone down there. The basement had a different feel from the rest of the hospital. The air was colder, heavier, and it always smelled faintly like detergent mixed with something metallic. The lights were dim and old, humming faintly, and there was a steady dripping sound somewhere near the laundry sinks. You could hear the pipes moan every so often. When I walked down there, my footsteps echoed long after I stopped moving. It was the kind of place you didn't linger in unless you had to. There were 2 elevators at the far end. One was in use, the other, an old freight elevator, had been out of service for months. There was a sign on it, a metal plate that said "Do Not Use," and the call button had been taped over. The doors were dented and stained from years of use. I passed it every night while cleaning the floor, never thought much about it. It was just part of the background. One night in December, near the end of my shift, I was mopping the long hallway that led to the old elevator. It was quiet around 3:40 a.m., the time when the whole building seemed to go still. I had my cart parked near the laundry door and was just pushing the mop back and forth, thinking about what to grab for breakfast when I got off. The clock on the wall made a slow, ticking sound that seemed louder than usual. Then I heard it, a soft ding. It was the elevator call bell. At first, I thought I imagined it. I stood there, mop in hand, listening. Then it dinged again, clear, sharp from the direction of the old elevator. I looked up and saw the small light above the doors glowing red. The button light was on. The tape was still over it, but the bulb underneath was lit. I froze for a second. That elevator hadn't worked since summer. I'd seen maintenance crews working on it months ago. They said the wiring was fried. It wasn't even connected to the power circuit anymore. Started to think maybe someone upstairs hit the wrong call button, and it was some kind of electrical feedback. But as I watched, the floor indicator, an old digital panel above the door, changed. It lit up with the letters B2. There's no B2 in St. Luke's, there's only one basement level. I stared at that glowing B2 for maybe 5 seconds before it went dark. Everything went quiet again. I stood there, not sure what I'd just seen. The hum of the lights filled the silence. The smell of bleach hung heavy in the air. My hands felt damp against the mop handle. I walked toward the elevator. My shoes squeaked faintly on the wet floor. As I got closer, I noticed a faint vibration, like the kind you feel through the ground when a heavy machine stops running. I reached out and pressed the call button, tape and all. It didn't click. It didn't even light up. I stood there for a few moments, listening. Nothing happened. Then I heard the sound of metal shifting, a soft creak, and the doors slid open about halfway before stopping. The interior lights were flickering, pale yellow, dim. The elevator car was sitting there, empty. The floor inside was wet, not like someone had spilled something. It looked like a trail. 2 wide streaks, darker than the metal floor, dragging from the back of the car out toward the hallway. The streaks had that uneven look you get when something heavy is pulled along a slick surface. I stepped closer, peered down. The marks glistened in the light. It looked like water, but the smell wasn't right. It was musty, like old damp rags. I didn't want to step inside, but I had to check. I leaned in a little, trying to see if there was any leak or if a pipe above had burst. The corners of the elevator were dusty, untouched for months, except for the wet drag marks that stopped just at the lip of the door. I looked down at the floor outside the car. The marks ended abruptly, like whatever made them was pulled out and then stopped. The doors shuttered and started to close again. I stepped back fast, heart pounding, watching them seal shut with a dull click. The button light turned off. The indicator panel above went completely dark. I stood there for a while, just staring at the closed doors, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it had to be something mechanical. Maybe condensation from the pipes above dripped into the car, and someone on another level had triggered a power surge. It was an old building. Weird things happened all the time, but when I checked the floor again, the marks looked fresher, as if they were spreading slightly, seeping into the cracks of the concrete outside the elevator. That smell, wet old laundry, was stronger now. I backed away, pushing my cart toward the laundry room, pretending I didn't see it. I called maintenance from the phone near the supply room. The line rang for a while before someone picked up. I told them the elevator was acting up again and maybe leaking from a pipe. They said they'd log it for morning checks since there wasn't supposed to be any power going to that unit. I didn't mention the B2. I finished my route faster than usual that night. Every sound seemed sharper. The hum of the air vents, the rolling of my cartwheels, even the small squeak of my shoes sounded loud. When I finally clocked out and went up to the main lobby, it was just starting to get light outside. I told myself I'd check with maintenance when I came back the next night. When I returned, there was caution tape across the elevator doors. A yellow tag from maintenance was pinned on it. I asked one of the day cleaners what had happened. He said the maintenance guy checked the elevator logs and found no activity. No power usage, no button press records, nothing. They opened the control panel, and the whole circuit was dead. Whatever I'd seen, it didn't register anywhere. The day crew said they found nothing inside either. The car was dry. No drag marks, no smell. Just dust and debris. Like no one had touched it. I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but when I went back to my supply closet later, I saw the faint outline of 2 streaks on the concrete floor outside the elevator. Faded, but still there, just visible when the light hit right. I didn't say anything to anyone about that. After that night, I stopped cleaning the basement alone. I changed my route so I'd do it earlier, around midnight when the laundry staff was still there. If they weren't, I skipped it and came back when someone else was nearby. I didn't want to hear that bell again. A few weeks later, the old elevator was sealed off completely. They welded the doors shut and built a small wall section over it. Official reason was safety hazard due to structural instability. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. Every now and then, when I walk past that end of the hallway, I still feel something strange. A faint vibration under the floor, like a truck passing far off. It's probably just the boiler system, or the washing machines running nearby. That's what I tell myself. But sometimes around that same time of night, when everything's still and quiet, I think about that glowing B2 on the panel, and those wet drag marks on the concrete. I think about how it didn't show up in the power logs and how no one else ever saw it. I kept working there for another year, but I never went near that elevator again. It stayed sealed behind that wall, hidden like it had never been there. Still, every time I walked through the basement, I'd glance at that spot without meaning to. Just a blank stretch of wall now, but it always felt colder there. Like the air didn't move right. I never heard the bell again, but I never forgot the sound of it. The soft, clean ding echoing through an empty hallway at 3:40 in the morning, when you know for certain that no one should be calling that elevator. I took a night security job at a shipyard on the coast, about an hour outside the city. It was one of those jobs that seemed too quiet to be difficult. Just keep an eye on the dry dock, make sure no one wandered in, and write a report every few hours. Midnight to 6 in the morning, 7 nights a week. It was steady work and I needed the money. The place was old. Half the boats had been sitting there for years waiting for repairs that never came. Rust crawled over everything. The metal catwalks creaked when the wind came off the bay, and you could smell salt, diesel, and algae mixed together all the time. The dock lights buzzed and flickered, casting long shadows over the hulls of the boats. Every night felt the same. I'd park by the small guard shack, sign in, walk the perimeter once, then make a slow loop through the dock area. After the first week, I stopped expecting to see anything interesting. The only sounds were the flags clanging against poles and the distant hum of cargo ships further down the bay. I kept my thermos of coffee on the counter and usually passed the time watching the tide rise and fall under the floodlights. That night started out no different. Cold air, clear sky, not a single other person around. The dock always had a strange stillness after midnight, like the whole place had been drained of life. Even the gulls disappeared by then. I did my first walk around 1 o'clock. Everything was fine. The gates were locked, the lights were working, and the dry dock looked the same as it always did. Lines of boats propped up on blocks, some stripped to bare metal, others with peeling paint and broken windows. I was halfway across the main gangway when I heard the sound. Footsteps, slow, heavy, echoing through the steel walkway. I stopped and listened. They were maybe 30 or 40 feet ahead, coming from the direction of the old trawlers. The sound had that distinct metallic ring, like someone in boots walking on hollow metal. I called out automatically, just to make my presence known. The sound stopped. The air went completely still for a few seconds. I waited, thinking maybe it was just the wind playing tricks, but then I heard one more step, just one, and then silence again. The trawler closest to where the sound had come from was called Martha Jean. The paint was so faded you could barely read the name. I walked over to it, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The closer I got, the more I could smell that mix of oil, seawater, and rot. The boat was dry docked on blocks, tilted slightly to one side. I climbed the short metal steps up to the deck and shined my light through one of the broken windows. For a split second, the beam caught a face. It was pale, half hidden behind a bulkhead. I only saw it for a moment before I jerked the light away by instinct, like my brain didn't process it fast enough. I steadied my hand and shined the light back into the same spot, but the space behind the bulkhead was empty. I figured it was a worker sleeping off a shift, or maybe one of the local, drunks who sometimes wandered near the docks. I didn't want to deal with an accident report later, so I climbed onto the deck. The metal groaned under my boots. Inside, the air was stale and cold, and the smell of old fuel hit hard. The flashlight beam cut across rusted railings, piles of rope, and an oily tarp spread across the deck. I walked slow, sweeping the light around. Everything looked dead, untouched for years. The sound of the bay echoed faintly through the hull. I called out again, half expecting someone to stir from behind a crate or bulkhead. Nothing. I walked to the cabin entrance, the floor sticky with oil and sea grime. The interior was stripped down, just bare walls, some broken dials, a few cables hanging loose. My flashlight caught something near the door, scratch marks in the metal. I leaned closer and saw small letters carved into the wall. Nobody leaves night shift. The letters weren't new. They were thin, rough, like someone had used a small blade or a nail. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prank from years ago, something workers did to mess with the new hires. Still, it felt strange. I left the boat after another careful look around. Nothing moved. I noted the odd graffiti in my logbook and went back to the shack. The rest of the shift dragged by. Every little sound set me on edge. The creak of metal, the flap of canvas, the faint tapping of rigging lines in the wind. I watched the boats from the window until dawn. When the day crew came in, I told my supervisor what I saw. He laughed, said one of the workers had gone missing a long time ago. Wandered off one night, never came back. They figured he quit, maybe hopped a ship out of town. He told me the carving was probably just old graffiti. That boat's been through dozens of workers, he said. They all get weird ideas at night. I didn't say much. I just nodded and went home. But the thing about the night shift is, the quiet starts to stick with you. By the time I got back that night, I was already thinking about those words. The idea that someone had taken the time to carve that message there, alone, in the dark, didn't sit right. When I started my rounds again, I went straight to the Martha Jean. I wanted to look at it in the same light, same spot. Maybe I'd imagined the carving. Maybe it was nothing. I climbed the gangway, crossed the deck, and looked at the wall where I'd seen the words. They were gone. The surface was smooth, freshly sanded like someone had cleaned or painted over it. The wall even had a dull sheen from where new metal showed through. No scratches, no trace of letters. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I was remembering the wrong spot. I checked every wall, every surface near the door, ran my fingers along the grooves of the metal. Nothing. That bothered me more than anything else. The shipyard didn't do cleanup work overnight, and no one had been on that trawler during the day shift, according to the maintenance log. I knew that because I checked the clipboard inside the shack. The last recorded entry for that boat was from 2 months earlier. After that night, small things started to change around the dock. A flashlight left on the counter would go missing, only to turn up later in another part of the yard. A padlock I swore I'd latched would hang open in the morning. One night I found my own notebook lying on the deck of a boat I hadn't even walked past. I started double-checking everything. Locked every gate twice, took photos of my log entries, marked my flashlight with tape. It didn't matter. Little things kept shifting, always subtle, always enough to make me doubt myself. The longer I worked there, the more that quiet got under my skin. The sound of boots on metal would come back now and then. Sometimes just 1 or 2 steps, sometimes a whole slow walk across the gangway. I never saw anyone. Every time I climbed aboard one of those old boats, the air felt colder, heavier, like the place held onto every sound and smell. One morning, after finishing my shift, I sat in my car for almost an hour before starting the engine. I looked out at the dry dock, at the rows of dead trawlers catching the sunrise. The water below looked calm, smooth as glass. Everything seemed normal again. But I couldn't shake the thought of that message. How it had been there one night and gone the next. I lasted another week before I quit. I didn't give a reason, just turned in my badge and keys. The supervisor asked if I was sure, said most guys didn't last long on that shift anyway. On my last morning, I walked one final loop around the dock. The boats were silent. The metal glowed orange from the low sun. I stopped by the Martha Jean, looked through the same broken window one last time. The light hit something on the far wall, faint scratches catching the reflection. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there again. In the same place. I didn't climb aboard. I just stood there, staring at the boat, until the sun rose high enough to drown out the reflection. Then I left. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Maybe it was just rust patterns, maybe I imagined all of it. But even now, whenever I hear the sound of metal echoing under my feet, I think about that night shift and how easy it is to disappear in a place where nobody's watching. I worked at a family-owned gas station just outside Bangor, Maine. It sat along a quiet 2-lane road that led out toward the smaller towns. Nothing but woods on both sides and a faint glow from the highway in the distance. The station had 2 pumps, a small convenience store, and a single security light that cast a yellow cone over the lot. I started working there in the winter when business slowed down. My job was simple. Restock shelves, clean up, keep the register running, and wait out the slow hours until dawn. The owner, a man named Carl, usually took the morning shift. But when one of the regular night guys quit, he asked me to cover the overnights until he could find someone else. He said it was easy money. Nothing happens after midnight, he told me. And that was mostly true. Most nights it was just me, the hum of the coolers and the wind moving through the trees behind the building. Once in a while, a trucker would stop for gas or coffee, but mostly I was alone. It was early March, cold enough that my breath fogged up every time I went out to check the pumps. That night had been especially quiet. Around 1:15 a.m., I decided to refill the drink coolers along the back wall. I grabbed a cart from the stockroom, loaded it with cases of soda, and rolled it over to the walk-in cooler. The metal door had one of those heavy spring hinges that always closed automatically behind you, but it never locked. You could push it open easily from the inside with the safety latch, which was just a black handle. The air inside the cooler was biting cold. My hands stung as I started stacking bottles on the shelves. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. The fans above hummed constantly, and the smell was a mix of cardboard, cold metal, and faint cleaning chemicals. I remember thinking it was colder than usual that night. I must have been in there for 5 or 6 minutes when I heard the door swing shut behind me with a sharp click. I didn't think anything of it at first. That happened every time, but when I finished stacking a shelf and went to push the handle, it didn't move. I pressed harder. Nothing. I hit it again, thinking maybe the spring latch had jammed. Still nothing. I tried pulling on it, then slamming my shoulder into the door, but it didn't budge. For a second, I just stood there breathing out clouds of vapor, trying to figure out what was going on. I gave the latch a few more hits with the palm of my hand. Nothing. The cold was starting to seep through my hoodie. My phone was on the counter by the register, maybe 20 feet away on the other side of the door. I cursed myself for not bringing it in. I started banging on the door with both fists, hoping maybe someone passing by outside might hear it, though that was wishful thinking. Nobody drove that road at night. The only thing within sight was a closed-down diner across the street, its sign flickering dead letters in the dark. I banged harder, yelling out, but the thick insulation of the cooler swallowed most of the sound. After what felt like 10 minutes, I stopped to catch my breath. The air was so cold it made my teeth hurt when I breathed through my mouth. My hands were numb, my heart racing. I leaned my head against the metal and listened, hoping to hear something. Footsteps, a car pulling in, anything. That's when I heard it. It started faint, almost like the sound of a branch scraping against the side of the building. But the cooler didn't face the woods. It faced the store's interior. It came again, a slow, steady scratching on the metal from the other side of the door. Light but deliberate. Fingernails or something thin dragging slowly across the surface. The sound traveled up and down, then stopped. I froze, listening. I called out, my voice echoing off the cold walls. Nothing. Silence for a few seconds. Then the scratching started again. Slower this time, like whoever or whatever was out there was trying to listen to me. It stopped the moment I spoke again. I remember standing perfectly still, my breath shallow, staring at the door. My brain kept trying to explain it. Maybe a mouse, maybe something in the compressor vibrating. But the noise didn't sound mechanical. It was too precise. I started yelling again, pounding the metal harder, hoping to scare it off or draw attention from outside. No response, just silence. Then, after maybe a full minute, the scratching started up again, only softer, closer to where the latch was. I could almost imagine fingertips tracing along the edges, like someone feeling for a way in. I hit the door again, then kicked it, my boot thudding against the cold steel. My breath was coming out fast now, fogging in the air, mixing with the white vapor from the fans above. I don't know how long I stood there like that. Time moves strange when you're scared. Could have been 10 minutes, could have been 30. My fingers started going numb. I rubbed them against my jeans and started pacing to keep warm. Every few minutes I'd hear the scratching again, short bursts that always stopped when I made noise. At one point I leaned close to the door, pressing my ear against it, trying to hear something. For a moment there was nothing, just the faint hum of the fans. Then a single tap, light, metallic. Then another, slightly higher up. I jumped back, slipped on the wet floor and hit my elbow against a crate. The noise stopped again. I started to panic. I thought about breaking one of the glass panels on the cooler wall, but they were thick and reinforced. Even if I did, I'd have to climb through racks of bottles. The thought of cutting myself and bleeding in that freezing air made me hesitate. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the latch clicked. A soft metallic sound, like it had been released from the outside. The door swung open a few inches. Cold air spilled into the store and I stumbled out, gasping, shivering. my hands shaking so hard I could barely push the door open wider. I looked around the store, expecting to see someone there, maybe a customer or a prankster, but the place was empty. The aisles were still. The lights buzzed overhead. Nothing had moved. I checked the front door. It was still locked from the inside. The closed sign hung the same way I left it. I walked around the counter, grabbed my phone, and turned on the screen. 42 a.m. I'd been stuck for about 25 minutes. I walked through every aisle, checked behind the shelves, even peeked out the front window. The lot was empty, only the security light casting that yellow circle on the concrete. Beyond it, the woods looked black and endless. No tracks, no cars, no footprints in the thin layer of frost near the door. When I finally sat down behind the counter, I couldn't stop shaking. My clothes were damp from the condensation inside the cooler, and my hands felt raw. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the old burner, and just sat there staring at the monitor showing the security feeds. I rewound the footage to around 1:15 a.m., right when I had gone into the cooler. The black and white feed showed me rolling the cart over, stepping inside, and the door closing behind me. After that, nothing. The camera faced the door straight on, so if anyone had walked up, they'd have appeared in full view. But the feed stayed empty. For nearly 20 minutes, the picture didn't change. No movement, no shadows, nothing. Then at 1:41, the door opened by itself. No one had touched it. No one had come in or out of the store. I replayed it over and over, staring at the screen, trying to see something I missed. There was nothing. The door just opened like someone had released the latch. When Carl came in that morning, I didn't tell him the whole story. I just said the door jammed, that maybe the spring was going bad. He nodded and said he'd look at it later, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He said the latch had been replaced just a few months earlier. I worked 2 more nights after that. Both times I couldn't stop checking the door every few minutes, making sure it stayed open when I was inside. But the place felt different after that night, too quiet, like the silence had weight to it. I started hearing things that might have been normal before. The compressor kicking on, the ceiling fan clicking, but now every sound made my stomach tighten. On my last shift, I caught myself staring at the cooler door for nearly 5 minutes straight, just watching it, waiting for it to move. It didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it could any second without warning. When my shift ended, I took off my apron, left the keys on the counter, and walked out before Carl came in. I didn't bother to pick up my last paycheck. I figured it wasn't worth explaining. Sometimes I still stop for gas near that area, but I never go back to that station. It's still there. Same yellow light, same sign, same empty lot at night. Every time I drive by, I look at that walk-in cooler through the glass and wonder what really kept me inside that night. Maybe it was the cold air expanding against the metal, or a warped latch that stuck for no reason. Maybe the pressure equalized and made the door pop open again. But every time I think about that slow, careful scratching, how it stopped when I made a sound and started again when I didn't, I can feel that same cold air in my chest. And I know I'll never go back inside a walk-in cooler alone again. I worked nights doing yard checks for a freight company in northern Illinois. The job was simple but lonely. Walk the lines of idle rail cars, check serial numbers against the manifest, make sure everything was where it should be, and report any open cars or damage. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The place was massive, miles of track stretching into the dark, rows of boxcars, tankers, and flatbeds. The noise of the highway faded once you got a few lines deep. Most nights it was just me, the wind, and the creak of metal cooling in the cold. In February 2024, there was a brutal cold snap that week. The kind of cold that cuts through every layer you put on. The wind chill sat around 10 below zero. I wore insulated coveralls, a heavy coat, face mask, gloves, and still, every time I exhaled, my breath froze on my scarf. The ground was solid ice between the rails, and every step made a hollow crunch that echoed far off. I'd done the route so many times I could walk it half asleep. Though I always tried to stay alert, yard injuries happen fast. And being alone out there meant no help would come quick. Around 3 a.m., I was halfway through the yard, checking a line of old boxcars that were supposed to be empty and decommissioned. The wind had died down for a bit, so the night was unusually still. You could hear the low hum of distant engines and the metallic tick of expanding steel. That's when I noticed one of the boxcar doors wasn't fully closed. It was slid about 2 feet open, just enough for a person to slip through. We got squatters sometimes, people sneaking into the yard to sleep inside cars out of the wind. The company wanted those cars locked up tight for safety and liability reasons. I radioed dispatch to log it. Boxcar 3468 wait, door open. Checking for squatters. Standard procedure. I waited for the acknowledgement, got it, and climbed up into the car. The instant I stepped inside, everything went black. My headlamp barely cut through the space beyond the doorway. It was one of those long, old boxcars, the kind that smelled like rust and stale oil. My light hit a wall of trash right away. Empty cans, torn sleeping bags, some old newspapers frozen into the floor. There was a dented metal pot near my boot, and the faint smell of burned something, wood maybe. At the far end of the car, I saw a set of boots placed neatly side by side. They weren't frozen or covered in frost. They looked recently used. I called out just a single word to announce myself, more out of habit than anything else. My breath fogged thick in the beam of my light. No sound came back, just the hollow ring of my own voice bouncing off metal. I stepped a little further in, my boots scraping against the floor. The trash rustled. I could hear the wind faintly through the open gap in the door behind me. It was the only sound. I moved my light around again. Blankets, food wrappers, a broken flashlight. Someone had definitely been staying there, probably still was. I turned to step back down, careful not to slip on the frozen edge of the doorway. My boot hit a slick spot of frost, and for a second I lost balance. I caught myself on the side of the car, heart pounding from that brief moment of losing footing. That's when I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was quiet enough that I might have missed it if the world hadn't been so still. A low voice right behind me said, "Don't close it." The words were close. Too close. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. The beam cut through the car, shaking with my hands, lighting the trash piles, the walls, the far corner. Nothing. Just that same pair of boots perfectly still. No footprints between me and them. The air felt wrong suddenly. Not colder, warmer. Like the air was moving against my neck. Like someone breathing close. I could feel heat through the layers of my coat. I froze there for maybe 3 seconds, trying to hear anything else. Nothing. Just silence pressing down so heavy it rang in my ears. I backed toward the door, still keeping the light out front. My heart was hammering. I stepped down onto the frozen gravel and hit the ground hard enough to feel it in my knees. I didn't bother with another look. I slid the boxcar door shut until it clanged against the latch and snapped it tight. I stood there for a minute, just breathing and listening. The wind started up again, carrying that dry, whistling sound through the yard. My gloves were stiff with cold and sweat. I wiped frost off my radio and called in. Car 346818 checked, no squatters. Door secured. I didn't mention what I heard. I finished the rest of my round fast, not really caring about the order anymore. Every sound felt sharper. The crunch of ice, the creak of the cars, the distant shifting of metal in the cold. I couldn't shake that voice out of my head. The way it sounded wasn't like someone whispering. It was clear, steady, like someone standing right behind me. By the time I got back to the guard shack at the edge of the yard, it was almost 4 a.m. The heater inside made my face sting as it thawed out. I sat down, wrote the boxcar as checked empty in the logbook, and didn't say anything about the rest. There wasn't much to say anyway. It would have just sounded stupid, hearing things in the dark. Happens to everyone out there eventually. When the day shift came in around 6:45, I gave my usual brief report to the lead, handed off the clipboard, and went to grab my bag. I was still trying not to think about it when one of the day guys, Mike, walked in from outside holding something in his glove. He said he found it on one of the cars. He held out a folded piece of paper, small and dirty, edges stiff with frost. He said it was wedged in the latch of boxcar 346818, the same one I'd checked. I didn't say anything. He unfolded it and set it on the counter. The writing was dark and shaky, like it had been done with a pen that was freezing up. The words were simple. Stop sealing them in. We're still in here. That sentence just sat there between us. No one said anything for a long minute. Mike looked confused, maybe thinking it was some kind of joke or message from the homeless guy who'd been living there. They opened the boxcar again later that morning. There was no one inside, just the same trash, same boots. They found a makeshift fire pit in one corner, bits of burnt wood, melted plastic, and a patch of soot on the wall where smoke must have risen and blackened the steel. When I came in that night, the car had yellow tape over the latch and a tag saying, "Do not enter." I heard later from the maintenance guys that there were signs someone had been sleeping in there for weeks, maybe months. They found bones, small ones mixed in the debris. Animal bones mostly. But one of the supervisors said there might have been something else. They wouldn't say what. I don't know who wrote the note. I don't know when it was left there, or how long those people had been using the cars for shelter. I thought about that voice for a long time after. How close it sounded. How it said, "Don't close it," not "don't lock it," like whoever it was already knew what that sound meant. Doors sliding shut, sealing up the dark. Now when I walk the yard, I never close a car unless I can see every inch inside. I always leave the doors cracked just a few inches. Dispatch doesn't like it, but I don't care. Every time I pass boxcar 346818, the latch is still tagged, rust growing around the seal. It hasn't been moved since, but even now, in the middle of the night when the air goes still and the wind stops, I sometimes feel that same warmth at my back, like breath in the cold, and I keep walking. I don't turn around. I just keep moving down the line, boots crunching in the frozen gravel, counting numbers and trying not to think about who's still in there, waiting for the next person to close the door.